bee. The vital role of the bee. To be or not to be, we need bees in our society. To be or not to be.
Walk into the produce section of any modern grocery store, and you are surrounded by an industrial feat of agricultural logistics. We expect apples, berries, and melons to be piled high year-round, regardless of the season. This visualization shows what happens if we remove insect pollination. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we consume disappears. That missing third is an economic cornerstone. In the U.S., those vanished bites account for over $34 billion in agricultural value annually. But the biological infrastructure supporting this output is cracking. Beekeepers who maintain the hives responsible for these crops are reporting winter losses as high as 40 to 60% of their colonies. At the exact same time, insect populations living outside those commercial hives are crashing. 1 in 5 native wild pollinators in North America now faces an elevated risk of extinction. The stability of our food web relies on 2 separate categories of bees, each currently struggling against a unique set of overlapping threats. There is a widespread public misconception that the honeybee is a native part of the American wilderness. In reality, European settlers imported them in the 1600s, and today we manage them strictly as agricultural livestock. Because of their role in commercial farming, they are treated as an industrial workforce. Feeding exclusively on one type of pollen severely restricts the nutrients they need to maintain their health. Physical exhaustion leaves the colonies vulnerable to biological attacks. Parasites like the varroa mite attach themselves to the honeybees, weakening their immune systems and leaving them susceptible to a host of lethal diseases. When industrial transit and nutritional deficits are compounded by parasites, the honeybee's defenses break down. This triggers rapid colony collapses that put our commercial food supply in immediate jeopardy. While honeybees handle the industrial shifts, an entirely different ecological workforce operates out of sight. North America is home to roughly 4,000 species of native wild bees, such as bumblebees and mason bees. These wild insects do not produce a honey harvest, and they do not live in managed boxes. The majority of them are solitary creatures that build their nests underground or in hollow twigs. These bees developed highly specialized evolutionary traits, such as buzz pollination. By vibrating their bodies at a specific frequency, they shake pollen loose from flowers that honeybees cannot effectively pollinate, including crops like tomatoes and sweet peppers. Their survival depends on local flora, which is rapidly disappearing. As native wildflowers are replaced by expansive grass lawns and concrete sprawl, wild bees lose both their food sources and specific sites they need to nest. This loss is compounded by pathogen spillover. When diseased commercial honeybees visit local flowers, they can leave behind contaminants that subsequently infect and kill wild bee populations foraging in the same area. Native bees are currently losing their ancestral habitats to human development, while catching novel diseases from the commercial livestock brought in to support our agriculture. A chemical threat multiplier further affects both managed and wild populations. The widespread agricultural use of toxic pesticides like neonicotinoids reduces a bee's ability to forage, care for its offspring, and survive. Rising temperatures also break a vital biological synchronization. As spring arrives earlier, some plants bloom and wilt before the native bees emerge from hibernation, leaving the insects without food and the plants unfertilized. Addressing these pressures requires action at every scale. Organizations like the EPA are working toward clean stock certification programs that test commercial bees to ensure they don't spread pathogens to wild populations. In the fields, agriculture must shift toward reducing chemical use and replacing sterile monocultures with diverse floral borders that provide year-round nutrition. Individual homeowners can also directly combat habitat loss. By planting eco-regionally appropriate native flowers instead of maintaining non-native grasslawns, you can provide a vital refuge for wild pollinators. Deliberate and clear. We rely on the labor of these insects for a significant portion of our most nutritious food. Protecting both the commercial honeybee and the wild native bee is the urgent maintenance required to keep the stability of our global food supply from fracturing. Massachusetts holds a surprisingly dense level of ecological diversity. The state is home to roughly 380 distinct species of native bees. Take the rusty-patched bumblebee. It is a keystone species that used to be ubiquitous across the region. Today, it is on the absolute brink of vanishing. This decline comes down to a specific dual threat. On the left side of the equation, we have the widespread use of toxic chemicals, specifically neonicotinoids. On the right, we have the eradication of natural forage, largely replaced by perfectly manicured, ecologically sterile suburban lawns. A single garden can't support a population if it's surrounded by miles of sterile, chemically treated turf. These native species need a continuous network of forage to survive, not a series of isolated, fragile islands. Massachusetts recognized that individual efforts alone couldn't close this gap. State and local governments have quietly turned the region into a real-world testing ground for a massive, multi-tiered ecological defense strategy. When chemicals are available on every hardware store shelf, voluntary restraint rarely reaches the threshold needed for biological recovery. Protecting the state's 380 species required moving past advice and toward regulation at the source. In 2021, the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources became the first state agency to restrict the consumer sale and use of neonicotinoids, diverting them exclusively into a locked channel for certified professionals. This restriction means everyday homeowners can no longer buy or apply these chemicals to their turf, lawns, trees, or ornamental gardens. Legally severing the supply chain through regulation is highly efficient. It physically removes the chemical from the environment rather than relying on the hope that every resident will read a warning label. Restricting the chemicals stops the act of poisoning, but the bees still require immediate, large-scale safe harbor. That brings the strategy down to the municipal level. Through the Bee Cities initiative, nearly half of the state's municipalities, places like Boston, Lexington, and Amherst, are actively rewriting their local landscape policies. A highly effective tactic here is lazy mowing. Cities intentionally alter their lawn management schedules to allow vital forage, like clover and dandelions, to thrive instead of cutting them down. Proposed state plans are taking this further by integrating pollinator survival into hard infrastructure. This includes planting forage directly around Department of Transportation solar energy installations and along state roadsides. Updating zoning codes and public works routines provides the actual physical architecture required to reverse habitat starvation across urban spaces. The question then becomes how the state verifies that these sprawling top-down policies are actually reversing the population decline. Local academic institutions provide the baseline data. UMass Amherst, for instance, supplies the research that proves initiatives like lazy lawns actually increase bee diversity. This academic research connects with community science programs. Initiatives like the Bumblebee Project and student-led tracking teams on the Boston Harbor Islands continuously monitor local hive health. These micro-level community data points form an essential feedback loop. They give researchers the hard numbers needed to prove whether top-down legislation is translating into actual biological survival on the ground. Despite this progress, the state's ecological defense shield remains vulnerable due to a massive unresolved loophole in the agricultural sector. The current primary threat is neonic-coated seeds. Because they are used in agriculture, they are exempt from the consumer ban. Once planted, their toxic coatings actively leach out, contaminating surrounding soil and water runoff. Conservation groups are currently applying intense pressure on state leadership, including Governor Maura Healey, to ban these coated seeds and close the agricultural loophole entirely. Preventing ecological collapse is an ongoing process. It requires the constant maintenance of this exact kind of civic and political friction. This approach works because it connects the macro scale of state law to micro-scale community tracking. It ensures a policy written in the capital results in more bees in a neighborhood garden.